Picture this. If someone walked into your home and spoke to you very rudely and was very condescending towards you, very critical, and was just downright rude to you, what would you do? Would you allow them to stay, or would you take some kind of action and ask them to leave? Chances are you'd probably try and get rid of that person and get away from them. You definitely would not like to be spoken to that way. Am I right? Well, here's the thing. There's somebody like that who speaks to you like that every single day. If you're wondering who, it's you. Yes, you. You speak to yourself in terrible, condescending, mean ways. And how do I know this? Because all of us do it on some level. All of us have something within us called the inner critic. And this inner critic usually comes about when we're feeling down, when we're feeling vulnerable and exposed, or when we're feeling insecure about ourselves in some way. The truth of the matter is that that inner critic has grown so loud, and you've become so accustomed, you've become so used to that inner critic that you probably don't even notice that it's there anymore. You probably mistake this inner critic for who you really are, and it's just something that you are so used to. The saddest part about this whole thing is that you believe your inner critic most of the time. And what happens when you believe your inner critic? Well, when you believe your inner critic, you start to feel worse and worse about yourself. Ironically, when you believe this inner critic, when you believe the worst of yourself, it is actually harder to make good decisions. It's harder to make good choices. Now, you might say,
Well, Zaahida, if I stop listening to this inner critic, I'm just going to be out of control, right? I'm not going to be a good person. I'm going to make the bad decisions.
you couldn't be more wrong. Yes, it's good to have a voice of reasoning and a voice of conscience and a logical, rational voice within us that helps us to choose between right and wrong and make good decisions in our lives and how we relate to other people. But the truth of the matter is that this inner critic is not the voice of conscience. It's a voice of criticism and contempt, and it just makes you feel bad. In many instances where you have anxiety taking over or a negative pattern, this loop thinking of negative thinking, it's usually the inner critic that is shouting in those moments. And I find that the biggest misconception and the biggest resistance to overcoming this inner critic is that a lot of people feel like that the inner critic is keeping them in check. But like I mentioned earlier, it doesn't keep you in check. It actually makes it harder for you to make good choices. So I'll give you an example. If you have a little child in front of you and you are critical of the child and you speak badly to them and you speak to them with contempt and you're just downright abusive to that child, do you think the child will listen to you? Yes, the child might actually listen to you, but at what cost? The child at times might listen to you and might over time even rebel and start to believe what you tell them. That child might start believing that it's a bad child and it can do no good and nothing it does is good enough. And over time, it does start to make worse and worse choices. Or the child actually is really scared of you and does everything that you ask, but at what cost? Because this child becomes petrified and becomes nervous and might have some other forms of symptoms that come up in response to that. So the point is, it's a similar kind of thing when you listen to your inner critic all the time and when your inner critic takes over. You might listen to it for a while, but it has negative effects on you. It has other symptoms might come up within you, mental or physical symptoms. Or you might start to believe that inner critic and you might say, well, what's the point? You get hopeless and you go, well, what's the point? Nothing I do is good enough anyway, so what's the point in trying? Let me just be this horrible person. So can you see where that trips you up? Now, in comparison, think about an instance where you speak to a child lovingly. You speak to a child in a good tone and you encourage this child and you motivate this child. And when the child does something wrong, you do correct them and you do enforce discipline in a loving, compassionate way. How much more likely are you to get the child's cooperation? And not only do you get the child's cooperation, you also ensure that this child is growing up in a healthy way with a healthy self-esteem and a healthy self-concept. So when you start to shift away from the inner critic and start to speak to yourself in more loving and compassionate ways and correct yourself where you need to, of course, it's not about just believing that you're perfect and not ever correcting yourself. Of course, you should check yourself. You should question your motives. You should check in with yourself to see if you are doing the right thing and behaving in your integrity. But when you speak to yourself in loving, compassionate ways and you correct yourself in loving, compassionate ways, not only does it help you to make better choices going forward, but it also helps ensure that you feel much less stressed and that you're less likely to have symptoms like anxiety, or if you already suffer with anxiety, it lessens the effects of that. So The way that you speak to yourself, that inner voice that you have, is so important. How would you change this inner voice? If you have a very loud inner critic, how do you move into being more compassionate and more gentle with yourself? Well, conscious awareness is the very first and most important step. Start becoming aware of how you're speaking to yourself. In moments where you're stressed out, in moments where you're feeling overwhelmed and anxious, question yourself. Listen to the thoughts that are going on in your head. Ask yourself, what am I thinking? How am I speaking to myself? And if you find yourself saying very harsh things in your own head, then start speaking to yourself in kinder ways. You might want to have an affirmation, or you might want to have some kind of saying that you say to yourself to just give yourself a sense of calm and a sense of ease. It might be something as simple as, I love and accept myself in this moment, or everything is going to be okay, or I am okay. It can be something as simple as, I am okay. So become very aware of the way that you speak to yourself, because that is going to play a huge role in how you feel moment to moment and will determine the kind of decisions that you can make. Transforming your life begins with transforming your mindset. And one of the most powerful ways that you can begin to transform your mindset is by changing the way that you speak to yourself, changing the inner voice, and listening to that mental dialogue and consciously choosing mental dialogue that is more helpful to you and that will help you make more constructive decisions going forward.